Good morning, everybody. Friday morning here, July the 6th. This is Navigating Modern Theology, Session 5, and it will be on language. I want to talk to you today about language, about words and meaning. And again, let's just kind of circle back what we've done. We started with the big opening up the question of religion and revelation with Barth. And the big shift, the Barthian shift that really was so powerful and significant, but has not really yet affected Christianity as such. It's and there are many reasons for this, and part of it has to do with this postmodern leap into almost a nihilistic abyss. I think a lot of folks are praying that they have parachutes on, as they've kind of jumped over the cliff. That's where you find a lot of people struggling with faith, because they're so postmodern they can't think their way out of a paper bag. But at any rate, that's neither here nor there. When it comes to language and words and meaning, one of the things that is recognized, of course, and has been recognized in both philosophy, especially since Immanuel Kant at the turn of the 19th century, all the way through philosophy through Heidegger, really, Paul Ricoeur, and others. You also find it in other. Well, I don't want to get too off track here. Let me just back up. There is this shift that occurs with language in the 20th century. And in order to really get at this, I want to take you all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And I want to talk about the deployment of a way of reading texts and creating meaning that was used in the early church that becomes really the dominant method of Christianity. And it'll play into kind of the work we do in mimetic theory. But let's go back now. In the early church, there developed two different schools of thought with regard to the biblical text. One comes out of Alexandria, one comes out of Antioch. And there will be framed all the theological debates. And underneath these debates lies a way of reading the text. Is the text to be read literally, or is it to be read allegorically? That is, does the text mean what it says, or is there a hidden meaning in the text? Allegory arose in the Greek world as a way of interpreting the myths of Hesiod and Homer, and the recognition by the developing Greek intellectual tradition that these stories of the gods, the motives and different things attributed to them are not worthy of the concept of God. And so we read these texts about the gods through a different lens. We can't take them literally according to the Greek intellectual tradition, but we can read them allegorically. That is, we can find a deeper meaning within them. And so we go searching for that because we know we can't read them literally. Now this problem comes to the fore right in the 2nd century for the early church with Marcion and the question of the anger of God in the Old Testament. Is this anger to be understood literally? Is it to be understood as God's real anger? How are we to understand this? And of course, one way to do it is just simply to reject the entire tradition, which is what Marcion did, as a dualistic Gnostic, unfortunately. The early church, however, didn't do us any favors when it turned around and said, well, God is this way, but there's hidden meaning behind it, and we got to go deeper into it. You see, it's the question of the anger or the violence of God that has prompted every single hermeneutical discussion in Christendom, and it arises from the Hellenistic tradition and the question of the anger of God. Okay? Now, I think you can also trace this to Jesus, historically as well as textually, and I think you see it in the Apostle Paul, the writer of the 4th Gospel. You see it in Luke. You see it even in Mark. You see an approach to the text that is neither literal nor allegorical. It is, in a sense, beyond both. It's not even a combination of the two. It's not a both and. It's something different. It's a very different approach to the text. Yes, Jesus and Paul both are going to use allegory as a genre. Jesus certainly does in the parable of the sower, and perhaps also later in the parable of the fish. Paul does with regard to Sarah and Hagar in the book of Galatians, chapter 4. But allegory is not the dominant method by which the New Testament writers or Jesus would have read texts. It just isn't. They are going to be reading texts through another lens. So in this business of language in the early church, what you're looking at is the question of how do we read texts, or as I put it last week with regard to the Swedish pietists, how do they mean? How do they mean? How are we to read these texts to begin with? And what's happened over the course of 2,000 years, particularly as a result of all the work done in the 20th century, and in a sense the breakdown of the category of the concept of the subject in psychology and literature, as well as philosophy, the recognition, the growing recognition over the 20th century, what we would call interconnectedness of life in terms of ecologies and physics, and the political concepts of solidarity and collectiveness and these kinds of things that have arisen. There's been a shift, okay? And it's still a battle. And in this shift, we have, particularly since the 1980s, engaged in what is largely a reader response to the Bible. That is, it's not so much that I go to the Bible and interpret the Bible. Okay, I'm not reading what the text says. The text doesn't have meaning. No, I give it meaning. I give it meaning. And that's fine. We all do this. But the problem is, what if the meaning we're giving it isn't the meaning that it's on the trajectory of moving us toward? What if we're importing meaning into something that has an ulterior meaning, a different meaning? And thus we make the text be what it's not. Now, in order to complicate this, I want to show you a picture, and I want you just to say what is the first word that comes to your mind. I'm just going to show you a picture and just tell me what you see, okay? You ready? Here you go. Okay, what did you see? Do you need to see it again? I'll show you again. Here it is. Ready? What do you see? What do you see? Did you see a duck? Did you see a rabbit? This is Wittgenstein's wonderful drawing where he will talk about seeing as. It could be a duck. You can see it as a rabbit. It is not both. It is how your mind patterns. It's what's known as, Wittgenstein calls this the aspect. And I want to read a little bit here from Ray Monk's great biography of Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius. He says, the point about the figure is that it can be seen under more than one aspect. The same drawing can be seen as a duck and as a rabbit. And it is this phenomenon of seeing as that interests in Wittgenstein. Okay. What Wittgenstein is going to do here is he's going to critique this phenomenological tradition that is going to make the case that while the figure hasn't changed, our perception has. And so he's going to use this to critique this. Watch this absolutely subversive move Wittgenstein makes. In describing this sort of phenomenon, this seeing as, there is a great temptation to talk of psychological states as if they were objects of some kind. That is, to talk about this aspect or this seeing as a psychological state. There's great temptation of that. For example, we might say that when we see it now as a duck, now as a rabbit, the external figure, the drawing, has not changed. What has changed is our internal picture, our sense datum. And if this idea were generalized, it would lead to the very theory of sensory experience that is the target of Wittgenstein's philosophy of psychology. The phenomenologist notion that the objects of our immediate experience are the private, shadowy entities that empiricists call sense data. This is the problem of liberalism. It starts right here. It begins here with this, what it will construe as sense data. It's a problem with the charismatic movement and its inability to understand the relationship between perception and knowledge. Monk continues, it is for fear of this kind of generalization that one of the first points Wittgenstein makes about aspect seeing in the lecture quoted above and in the investigations is that it is not typical. We do not see everything as something. He says, he's quoting Wittgenstein. It would have made as little sense for me to say, now I am seeing it as to say at the sight of a knife and fork, now I'm seeing this as a knife and fork. Now I'm seeing this as a bottle of insect repellent. Now I'm seeing this as a doohickey for my hair. Now I'm seeing this as, we just don't do that. We see as. We see as, okay? And this is the real problem with regard to language. We all come to this business of words with grids. Of course, we recognize this. Dear God, Michel Foucault, you know, and the great postmodernists, thinkers from Derrida, they've all shredded, absolutely shredded our capacity to connect words and things, or so they think. But in terms of philosophy, they're absolutely gone. Words don't have meanings. We create meanings, we import meanings, we make meanings, but things don't have meanings in and of themselves. There's no real connection between sign and signified, or signifier and signified. There's no real connection. Language is set loose in this mass transit system of the human species, forever exchanging ideas, and there's no real meaning in anything. However, my greatest critique of postmodernism is pretty simple. Jacques Derrida comes home. His wife says, honey, please do the dishes. They don't get done. She comes to him again. She says, Jacques, honey, please do the dishes. And they don't get done. She comes to him third time, bams him on the back of the head and says, hey, Derrida, do the goddamn dishes. And he says, well, I didn't see the meaning in that. That's the problem with play. Of course, it's not real life. Deconstruction is not real life. We don't live real life in a mode of deconstruction any more than we live a life in a world where we go around saying how we see as. Oh, I see this as a pen. No, it's a pen. It's just a pen. And so we run into the problem of how we're going to deal with the big meta questions about God, which is a term. It's just a term. It's a word. How we're going to deal with this term. Does it have meaning? And if so, what is the meaning that we can give it? And if you think that way, you're already a liberal. You're already a liberal. You have a category that you have to define. And when you define that category, then you go to Scripture and you fit Jesus and the Trinity and everything else into that category. And that, my friends, is the ultimate problem that Karl Barth saw with starting with philosophical positions, whether it was Paul Tillich or whether it was the Christian fundamentalist, the Orthodox Reformed pastor in his parish. It was still a wrong move. Words are corrupt. Now, this is something that we have to give to the 20th century philosophers and psychologists who really do point out that words are distorted. There's distortion here in our language. Girard has shown us where this distortion comes from. It comes right out of the victimage mechanism. Myth, that is the linguistic structure of the way we articulate this ritual act of immolating a victim. Myth is the way we structure our reality. It is the way we do cosmos, okay, in the Johannine sense, world, cosmos, or sarx, flesh, in the Pauline sense. It's the same thing. When we begin with the need to define, we are already starting from the wrong place when it comes to Christian theology, and this is what Barth saw. Barth recognized the problem with language head on in Church Dogmatics 1:1. I mean head on. We'll end up with this marvelous quote after he establishes a theory of revelation. He says, revelation is a gain to language. Now, I've articulated elsewhere in a Facebook post, and you can probably find it in What the Facebook Volume 1. I have a post called Language is Bloody. It may even be in the Hermeneutics series of Volume 1 of What the Facebook. But in that post, and I did reprint part of that in my Medic Theory and Biblical Interpretation, what I was getting at is that all of our language, all of our words, all of our ability to interpret everything that we think, the structures of thinking that we possess, it's worse than Foucault and Derrida realize, because it's not just simple abstraction. It's that we are fine-tuned to scapegoat. We are fine-tuned to myth-make. That's who we are as a species. And it comes up all the time in the way we read each other and read texts and read our experience, because we're always looking for someone or something to blame. And that's the proof of the pudding. When you read something and you're looking to blame something or someone, you read your life, you read your circumstances, you read texts, when you're looking for someone to blame, that's the problem. That is the satanic reading. That is where you start looking for hidden meaning in things, not grounded in reality, but grounded in a preconception of who God must be, apart from his revelation in Jesus Christ by the Spirit, and because you're trying to fit an enormous, enormous round peg into the teeniest of square holes, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And this is the problem we have in the church. And this is where in the I should go all the way back actually to the 17th century, when the universities and Renaissance humanism had propelled itself through the Reformation into now an emerging secularism in Europe. One of the things we find is this beginning, this recognition that there is a doubting about language and thinking. This is the genius of Descartes, by the way. I'm not Cartesian, but I think the move that he made back then, I think, therefore I am, that is, I doubt. I can doubt that I exist, therefore I exist. Okay? This break is nothing other than the law of anti-idolatry that Sandy Goodhart finds in the prophets, in his Girardian work, Sacrifice and Commentary, and his other books. That is, this recognition of something is not something. This idol is not God. That's the critical principle of the Bible, and it becomes the secular principle of modernity. That very principle becomes the secular principle of modernity. The doubting that goes on. That's a theological principle. However, with the gospel, this doubting framework now has a place within which to dwell, and that's the trust that one has in Father, Son, and Spirit. That is, one trusts that God is who God says God is, and at the same time always recognizes that one's theology, one's ability to articulate this in language and knowledge and thought structures and metaphysics and everything else is always provisional. It's penultimate. That doesn't mean it doesn't bear a relationship to the ultimate, to reality, capital R. But it does mean that our theology is not God. Theology, personal theology in the West, has become an idol. In America, it is the worst form of idolatry you can see. People believe in their theologies. People believe in their theologies, man. They believe in them. They really, both right and left, liberal and conservative, they believe in their theologies. They haven't yet begun from the Christian epistemological perspective, which absolutely guts language, and that's on the cross, which begins with trust, absolute trust that God is the one who can take language, bring revelation to it, and make it something else. So much so that an event of crucifixion produces such a powerful shift in language and resurrection, which becomes shalom. Not vengeance, not anger, not wrath, not retribution, but shalom. And there's your great big linguistic shift, and we can't even get into that today and what that entails and implies. However, what I'm trying to show you right now is that this business of the text had a meaning, and so we can go back to it and we can discern the author's intention. These things continued to be up for debate even into the 1980s with Ed Hirsch's book, Validity in Interpretation, where he's arguing that you can get back to an author's meaning. You can know what the author intended. That's the words. What did the author intend? But if there's anything we know anymore, folks, we cannot do this. We cannot say what an author intends. I think we don't have to go the route of Derrida and deconstruction and say we can never know what's happening in a text. I think what we can do is we can recognize the trajectory an author is on by the voice they give. That is, with the three-voice paradigm of mimetic theory, the voice of the victim of myth, the victim in travail, the forgiving victim, we now have the opportunity to recognize that we are dealing with myth and mythic thinking at every turn, and we're dealing with the victim of myth, the victim in travail, who's still stuck in myth, not yet in gospel, broken away from myth, but kind of stuck there, not yet in gospel, and then the forgiving victim, which is the voice of God, the revelatory voice. It's these three voices that one discerns, and which is why it is so important that the Bible itself contains myth and mythic structures all through it. Genesis 1 through 11 is myth, modeled on ancient Near Eastern mythologies. But it also contains within itself a savage critique of myth, as does the rest of the book of Genesis. Torah contains both a critique of myth and a remything. The prophets, same thing. But you begin to move in the Jewish tradition more and more toward this notion of the forgiving victim. You don't really find it until Jesus. Other books of the Hebrew scripture that are structured mythically, the book of Job is a direct, and I don't mean that this was why it was written or anything, but it's a direct counterpart to the play of Oedipus, the king. Job is the anti-Oedipal character of the Bible, as René Girard points out. There is the very few rare instances of pure myth, that is the way it's structured in the ancient Near Eastern world, in the scriptures, but you do find, for example, Joshua chapter 7 is an example of pure myth-making. 1 Kings 17 is an attempt to turn this, to create the actual creation of the Samaritan myth, which will be the dominant myth of Second Temple Judaism, and behind the ostracization, marginalization, and destruction of the Samaritans by the Judeans. But you know, myth affects everything, and here now you have this breaking in to myth, and that's why Girard says the Passion narrative is structured identical to myth. It has the 4 marks of what creates myth. And this is found in his book, The Scapegoat, about the introduction to the 3rd or 4th chapter, I believe, maybe even be the 2nd, where he talks about the 4 marks of myth and how the Passion narrative contains them all. And that the Passion narrative is historical myth. It's myth being enacted in the life of a singular human being, and the story's narrated this way. And it's a real human being, not a mythic human being like Oedipus. Okay? So it's important that the gospel and myth share the same structure. That's the only way the gospel is able to break through myth. It's important that God comes into our language as well and changes our language. Thus, the gospel alone can give meaning. There is no meaning apart from the gospel. Meaning, apart from the gospel, will always be an ephemeral journey into La La Land, because one can never know whether the meaning one thinks one has, one's reading a text or reading another person or reading oneself, one can never know if that meaning is true. Now, the Bible also addresses this in quite a different fashion. It talks about self-deception. Frequently in the prophets, Jesus talks about it. Paul talks about it in Romans 7. The propensity to self-deception is absolutely extraordinary. Something that Girard recognizes that we have to have in order to create myth. We have to actually believe we don't have scapegoats. Everybody else has scapegoats. We don't have scapegoats. Everybody else does. The people that we get rid of, we justly get rid of. They're justly marginalized. But the people that others get rid of, those are scapegoats. Okay? Girard says we cannot see our own scapegoat. And so as a result, when gospel breaks into myth, it breaks into our bloody language. That is the language that has arisen from the creation of transcendence in the victim. The victim, the first polyvalent symbol, that which can be both demonized and divinized, devil and God, the first symbol. And thus, the need to interpret. Interpretation arises out of our victimizing. All hermeneutics does, except for the hermeneutics of the cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is an entirely different hermeneutic. I have been stressing this and stressing this and stressing this forever. I think Dwayne Armitage gets it. I know Stephen Crosby gets it. I hesitate to mention other names, but nevertheless, the point is, we are here in 2018, okay, and we think we're lost in a fog. We're not lost in a fog. The fog is cleared for those with eyes to see, those with aspect seeing, those who, when everybody else sees a duck, they see a rabbit. You see? That's what the gospel does. It turns us to myth as gospel in order to see the problem of myth and the solution of gospel. That's why Jesus has to come to us as a stranger. He can't come to us as something we can grasp. He's constantly coming to us as one unknown. And we trust and we listen and we follow. That's the hermeneutic for reading the text. Now, again, the early church, the medieval church, up until even including so many in the mystical traditions or the pietist traditions, the bad pietist traditions, I should say. Of course, American Protestantism in general, this need to somehow find a hidden meaning in the text. That somehow God has written these texts and there's this hidden meaning underneath it, is really nothing more than a shell game. There is no hidden meaning in the text. You're not going to find Jesus in the book of Joshua in some kind of great spiritual battle thing going on here. No, you're going to find Jesus in the character or figure of Achan. That's where you're going to find Jesus. Okay? It's learning to properly identify the suffering servant, the true human in texts, not the Lord of glory. It's reading text through a theology of the cross, through the lens of the forgiving victim, not the voice of Abel, not the voice of the psalmist seeking vindication, not the voice of the prophet seeking eschatological retribution, but the voice of Joseph. You meant it to me for evil, God meant it for good, through the voice of Paul. I have learned to be content in all things, for God works all things together for good for those who love him. Oh, I see Ellen has popped in a question. Let me read that question. She says, could it be when everyone sees a duck, you see that there is also rabbit? Because it's just either or, wouldn't the rabbit people be as certain and blind as the rabbit people? I think she means as the duck people. Okay, so here's what I'm trying to say. There's not a certainty here. We're not dealing with that. We've thrown certainty out of the water entirely as the problem of the Greek intellectual tradition and its influence on the Renaissance and ultimately modernity. Its certainty is the problem. It's not the solution for anything. Trust is where we begin. Trust. You begin by trusting God because God shows God's self-trustworthy to you. You don't begin by deducing that God is trustworthy. And you find that when you trust God in the grievous circumstances of a life, that's real trust. Anybody can trust God when things are going well. It's those who trust God, the Father, when things are tough. Life works. I'm going to remind you of a story I posted a few days ago on my personal page about a woman now in Brazil who was raised in caves with her mother. And at one point when she was 11 years old, she actually killed a child for trying to steal her food. And she's lived with this grief and sorrow and regret for her whole adult life. When she was, I think it was young, she was young, her and her mother were separated. And they lived in abject poverty, below abject poverty. They didn't even live in the slums. They lived in caves. And that's how she was raised. That's what she knew. She would eventually go on to become a figure who made something of her life. I don't recall how she did it, but she will start a charity that works with the poor, and then she will get reunited with her mother. One of the beautiful things about it is she remembers as a child, constantly, her mother telling her how precious she was to her, the daughter to the mother, but also to trust God. And you read this, when I read this story, I'm reading about this, and I'm sure of Catholic mother, just teaching this child to trust God. And I thought, this mother has the heart of a St. Francis at this point, the heart of a grandfather, one who doesn't measure God's love by life circumstances, even though she's living in a cave with her daughter. It's precisely this cruciform trust out of which Christian theology develops, out of which language can change. So that's the shift in aspect that has to occur. And it has not occurred, frankly, for the vast majority of Protestants out there, whether they're the religious right or the religious left. Now look, as you all know, oh, got a kink at my neck sitting here too long without moving. Yeah, Helen, you're welcome. Most of my adult life until last year tended to be oriented toward the promotion of the values of what we would now call progressive Christianity, the promotion of positive inclusion for different gendered folks and their orientations, equality of pay and recognition and respect and dignity for women as well as men, the same. That judging a person on the color of their skin or the amount of money in their wallet is not right. And all the things, I've spent my entire adult life doing this. And I was absolutely astounded last year to get slaughtered by the progressives, the liberal left. I mean, it absolutely amazed me. And it literally is, it took me over 6 months to begin to piece together what had really happened. What had really happened at that time was that the liberal left was desperate at that point for scapegoats. And they went and found, I wasn't the only one, they went and found a fair number of them and started cannibalizing the best of their own. And at that point, you begin to see a unity in the so-called progressive movement that continues to allegedly develop. It's a false unity. The process of undifferentiation is so thick in progressive Christianity that that any moment of success for this movement is going to produce an infighting of the various different groupings that want top billing and their issues being presented. Top billing, okay? And it'll happen. It's inevitable. It's already happened on the religious right, and it will happen on the left as well. So when I look out at the American Protestant scene, really fundamentally all I see is Gnosticism of one sort or another, and a Christianity without Jesus. It's very simple for me. And so in that sense, I think that there are those who have been struck by revelation. It is a gift of God. Faith is a gift of God. Trust is a gift of God. It's, you don't just work up trust, man. It's a gift of God. You might feel like you're struggling to keep it, but it is a gift of God. And if you start going, why doesn't God give trust to everybody? I'm certain that that's all the Father is doing, is working with people to trust Him. I'm certain that's all the Father is ever doing. It's just that the mindless gray masses continue to think that this ego, this social construct, modes of knowing and knowledge and everything else, they think this is it. And it's not it. It's not it at all. It's part of a way of provisionally, penultimately being able to communicate about it, but that's it at best, man. That is it at best. It is time to finally put an end to the tyranny of the intellect, the tyranny of Greek philosophy, the tyranny of modernity, the tyranny of everything that has to do with the mind. The mind is the problem. It is not the solution. The gospel is the solution. The gospel transforms the mind. The gospel reorients one's thinking. The gospel reorients the way we see, so that we are seeing as Jesus saw. I just played on Wittgenstein. There's seeing as. We learn to see as Jesus saw. We learn to read the Bible the way Jesus read his Bible, and this kind of thing, you see. So when we talk about language and we talk about hermeneutics, we are deeply involved and deeply embedded in ourselves and each other and texts, videos we watch, podcasts we listen to. We're constantly interpreting. So the real question is, and the only question that matters is, through what lens? There are only two lenses. One is sacrificial, one is non-sacrificial. The sacrificial lens has two aspects: the victim of myth and the victim in travail. The victim that's covered up, or who in the telling of the story agrees with the community, they deserve what they get, like Oedipus. The victim in travail, like Abel, like Job, that says they're innocent but they want vengeance. Those are the victims, those are the sacrificial voices. And then there's the voice of the forgiving victim, the voice of compassion and mercy and absolute grace, the obliteration of economies of exchange, even in language itself. And that's the lens. That's the only lens that'll take you out of the matrix of religion, the matrix of human culture, the matrix of Christianity, the matrix of the Abrahamic religions, the matrix of religion in general. Religion doesn't take you out of religion. Revelation takes you out of religion. It's the only thing. You must be delivered from it. And if you're not, make your wishes known to the universe to be delivered from it. God hears and will deliver. All right, so I'll leave you with that for now today, a little bit more on navigating modern theology, how I do it, how I understand my relationship to postmodernity and modernity in the 20th century, why I think I'm onto something, and where I'm going. So I'll look forward to talking with you next week. Cheers and all the best. Peace out.